Remember them good old days? They weren't all that great. I can remember my grandma saying that just like it was yesterday. And she was talking to her sister who also lived through the Great Depression, World War II, and going forward. And it differs a lot from what many of the talking heads that are out there, either on TV, the interwebs, or the radio, what they're telling you that it's never been worse. And they'll tell that depending upon who the president happens to be or who's in the Congress and whether they agree with them. My name's Chris. I'm a historian. I've been teaching history for about 20 years. I have graduate degrees in both history and theology. And if you like this kind of content, be sure to go ahead and subscribe. Now, back to this idea that the good old days weren't all that great. If you look at my grandma, my dad and she have told me about her dad, and her dad was a barber. And that's not really all that uncommon. People are barbers. But the reason he was a barber was, and it's because he lost his leg in a mining accident when he was in his teens. Doesn't seem like that was all that great. Now, it's kind of interesting that actually losing his leg might have prolonged his life a little bit because I've read about black lung, which is a disease that gets into people's lungs because of coal dust and it causes the lungs to stop being able to take in oxygen and air, and people cough up this black sputum, really nasty. But what it did, it would kill people really, really quickly. It would disable people in their late 30s, early 40s, and then they might linger on for a few years. So since he made it to his 60s, it actually probably extended his life and might have given him a better life. Now, grandma had to go to the bathroom outside when she was a little girl, which is something that most Americans are not familiar with today, at least if they're not camping or something like that. Most houses, the vast majority, probably like 99.9%, even though I haven't looked it up, they have indoor plumbing. That was not the regular thing in the dirty 30s. The same grandma had an eighth grade education. And the reason for that was her dad. Her dad believed that girls should basically grow up to take care of men and have babies, and therefore they didn't need any of that fancy book learning. So he basically forced her to quit her education in the eighth grade. I knew that she had only gone to the eighth grade and had to get a GED, but the reason I didn't know that until after she died. Now, she did get married, she had a kid, she took care of her husband, but that husband died in her mid 40s. So she was left with an eighth grade education and then needed to support herself, even though her son was out of the house. So she had to go and get a GED so that she could qualify to work for the school system as a cook. Now, does that sound like good old days when people are not getting educated all that much? No. So the good old days in that regard were not all that good because it wasn't necessarily her choice to end her education. My grandma's son, my dad, he and one of his cousins who went to college at about the same time he did, they were the first two in the entire family to get a college education. And this was in the late 1960s, early 1970s. That was not an option for people who had come up in the family earlier. They had done manual labor all of the time. So that meant that my dad and his cousin had a bit of an easier life. You'll hear people talk about the high crime rates that are skyrocketing today. But if you actually look at the statistics, the cold hard numbers, crime rates were at their peak in American history about the time my dad was growing up in the 1950s and 1960s. And they have tended to go down since then. My dad's also old enough to remember segregated schools when the system was set up to have separate schools for African American students and white students. Today, we don't have that. And I would argue that that's a good thing. So, when looking at the question of whether the good old days were really all that great, we've gone from a situation in which my great grandfather worked in a mine as a teenager and he wound up losing his leg. I've met people as a young kid who had gone to work in the mines as early as 8, and that was not uncommon. We don't do that anymore. We have kids in school, so hopefully they can learn to read and write and think. I have not had to work in the mines as a child. I've had some manual jobs. I worked for McDonald's, for example, while I was in college. But the fact that someone who has working class roots can go to college and then teach in college, who can get a graduate degree, who can, do things like that, it's actually a good thing, I would argue. It has shown that things are not as bad as they once were. So when people argue that, oh, it's never been this bad, they're really not being honest with the facts. So, anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this. I want to thank you for watching. If you have enjoyed it, be sure to subscribe and like the video, and we'll see you next time.